Well, everyone, welcome. I'm so delighted to see you here, and delighted this evening has finally arrived. I've been with Ralph throughout the genesis and creation of this book, and it's been a huge labor of love for him. I'm really proud the book is now out and available. It's got 5-star reviews on Amazon, so that's very, very cool. And Ralph is about to head off on a West Coast book tour. He's leaving on Friday, and he'll be traveling from a little bit north of Mount Monterey at the Mount Madonna Center. That'll be his first reading, and making his way north from there to Vancouver and up to Cortez Island, where he'll be giving readings at both holistic learning centers and also at bookstores. So that's a very, very exciting thing that's about to happen. So I know this book, The Jeweled Highway, is something that Ralph has put his heart and soul into. I've seen it take shape along the way, and it's evolved quite a bit over the time he's been working on it. Just as an example, the book initially started in Ralph's teenage years, so he starts the book well into his teens. And then he later decided to kind of back up and include his parents and family in Wales. And for me, that was a very important shift because it added history, it added context, it was a sense of grounding, of place, and also just sort of a psycho-spiritual context to understand where this journey came from and what Ralph's yearning to find his own sense of meaning and purpose in life arose from. So I think, just in many, many ways, the book has evolved over time and has become richer for the thinking that's gone into some of the shifts in it. And it's become more personal over time as well. And I know he's devoted a lot of attention to creating the right format of the book so that it's a deeply personal story. And I couldn't resist quoting from one of the Amazon reviewers who wrote, as a young man, he threw himself into life courageously, giving himself over to the inner longing to find his own way. I thought that was a beautiful way of capturing the spirit of The Jeweled Highway. The book, when you get a chance to read it, has adventures in Tibet and South America. It evokes different periods of the evolution of the West Coast counterculture. It chronicles experiences Ralph had supporting the emergence of holistic impulses in Russia and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. So there's a whole adventure component. It also describes Ralph's major role in creating and seeding holistic centers, from the Findhorn Center in Scotland. Thank you. Great. The Omega Center in upstate New York, and of course the New York Open Center, which Ralph has devoted 30 years of his work to, a place that's really had a profound impact on the lives of New Yorkers. And really it's for this reason, for the work he's done here, and for what the Open Center represents in the culture and in his own life and in the larger holistic community, that he made the decision to launch the Jeweled Highway with this opening here at the Open Center. So I'm personally just very proud to be here tonight. When this book is launched, I've really been a fan of the book since the very, very beginning, since Ralph read me the first chapter he wrote, which was Journeying to Machu Picchu, and that's not exactly the right title, but it was about hitchhiking to Machu Picchu. And I was really amazed about the detail in which he captured an experience that happened quite a few years before he wrote it. So it shows that the emotions were very, very fresh, and the impressions, and that's what makes it a very dynamic book. So just in closing, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. We're really honored to have you all here, and I know it means a huge amount to Ralph. And my hope is that The Jeweled Highway will be a source of inspiration for its readers, and I know Ralph really shares that hope. So let's give a warm welcome to the author of The Jeweled Highway.
Well, here we are. been a long time coming. But, you know, over the years, the last 30-odd years here at the Open Center, I have introduced hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And now it's my destiny to tell my own story. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking. On the other hand, it's a lot of fun. And it's wonderful to see you all here. I really appreciate so many friends coming out tonight. And I'm thrilled that there are completely new people here who've never even been to the Open Center before. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah, let me just say a few words before I proceed to talk about the book. I really want to thank Nanette, who just introduced me now. Her dedication, her focus, her tremendous stick-to-itiveness, and her support has just been invaluable, as I say in the acknowledgements, in making this come together. You know, as Thomas suggests, she's a social justice lawyer for the poor in the South Bronx and has been for the last 25 years. And she's a very, very dedicated being in terms of service to humanity, and I've really benefited hugely from her attention and her care and her love during the creation of this book. So I'm deeply, deeply appreciative. And I want to thank somebody else too, actually, before we proceed tonight, who actually I'm so happy is able to join us. And that is the person who edited my book for Divine Arts Media, my publisher. He's able to join us, and those of you who've read it know he did an absolutely impeccable and very thorough job in nailing all the stuff, whatever typos and all the rest of it, whatever more felicitous phrases could have been produced. He was right there for me. He was really a wonderful editor, and I want to thank Ross Plotkin at the back here. You want to stand up, Ross? And he really did a great job. For Divine Arts Media, you know, which is it's a branch. It's a fairly new imprint. It's only been going for about 4 or 5 years, and it's a branch of MWP Productions. Most of their books are in the area of film, actually, and they invited me to a wonderful writers' summit out in LA in the winter, where I met a lot of my fellow writers who write for the MWP, and it was amazing. I vaulted right over the world of New York establishment, corporate publishing, and straight into Hollywood, and spent the whole day with Hollywood producers, directors, and screenwriters. And you know, we have our views of Hollywood, but these were some of the most creative people I've ever spent time with. So I have huge appreciation to the publishers, Divine Arts Media, and Alexandria, Egypt, when we did the esoteric quest for ancient Alexandria, Greco-Egyptian birthplace of the Western mind, which we co-sponsored with the Library of Alexandria about, was that 3 or 4 years ago? We just slipped in the middle of the revolution. So I'm really grateful to them. They've been wonderful, actually. It's been a real pleasure to work with Divine Arts. They've become personal friends. So, yeah, I think I need a sip of wine, too. Yeah, I will. So, what shall I say? You know, there's so much that could be said. This book has been a labor of love. I've always had the feeling I should just tell the story of what it's been like to take this journey. And as Nanette said, it started off, I thought, well, who's interested in my childhood, you know, my family? You know, I really should start. I was originally going to start it at a moment of alienation, actually. Oh, all right, mate, you got it. I was going to start it initially. The first draft of the book actually began at the age of 9. On that first morning when we had moved from spending my childhood on the coast of the Irish Sea in North Wales, which was exquisitely beautiful. And we lived just a couple of 100 yards from the Irish Sea, and I used to see the mountains of Snowdonia through our kitchen window. And many hours I would wander those tidal pools, attuned to that crash of the waves, the rhythm, the cry of the seagulls. You know, obviously I'm a nature mystic at heart. And it was incredibly jarring for me to suddenly at 9, because my father's job changed, to find north of England overnight. I don't know how many of you have seen those kitchen sink dramas that portrayed British working class life in the 1950s. But you know, this is where the Industrial Revolution began in the whole world. It's the world's original proletariat. This is where Marx thought the revolution would really happen. And it was grim, it was black, it was covered in soot. I will never forget waking up that first morning, and instead of looking out on the mountains of Snowdonia, I looked down in the valley below me, and it was 60 chimneys, thick chimneys, belching smoke into the atmosphere. And it was like, whoa, the whole city was jet black, covered in 150 years worth of soot. And everybody spoke like this, with northern accent, with Yorkshire accent. There's a few Brits here tonight, so you know what I mean. And it was a real shock after the more lyrical, sensitive world of Wales. So that's where I originally began the book, actually, at that moment of alienation. Because really it's a story. When I say it's a quest, you know, the subtitle of the book is A Quest for the Life of Meaning. It really was a quest, because I was just interviewed by Hay House Radio the other day, and they were asking me about faith and so on, which I guess is big in that world. And I had to say, look, I wasn't somebody who came into this world with a lot of faith around the world. I know this might have been heresy on Hay House Radio. But, you know, I was pretty immersed in a sense of the grimness of this world, which may be why Thomas More, in his lovely preface to the book, describes me as having a gritty, pub-like demeanor. When my cousin Shirley in Cardiff, the capital of Wales where I was born, when she researched the White family in 200 years back in Wales, it appears the only business the Whites have ever owned in 200 years, that we owned a pub in Neath in South Wales. So it's not surprising there's a certain gritty, pub-like demeanor in my bearing. But I started off that way, but I really felt, you know, the more I worked on the book, the more I felt, look, I want to acknowledge my ancestors. I feel I really should. And so I decided to tell the story of my grandfather and my father. And, you know, face it, you know, I was born into austerity Britain, if you know that phrase, post-war Britain, 1949, playing in bomb sites, still a very grey and grim world. I don't know how many of you have seen Vera Drake, that wonderful film, but that's the best film I've ever seen that conveys the vibe of post-war Britain. It was not a joyful place, but people were just happy. They were happy to be alive. They had survived the war. And I wanted to honor my grandfather, you know, coming back to this question of meaning and faith and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, my grandfather was in the thick of the First World War. He was in the trenches. I don't know how he survived 4 years in the First World War, but he did. He was a strong man, but obviously lucky as well. Then my father was in the thick of the Second World War, you know, went through in the second wave in Normandy all the way through to the surrender. You know, I grew up knowing all about the grimness of war, the Holocaust, all the horrendous things that had characterized the 20th century. And really, I couldn't see, to me, it was not obvious that there was inherent meaning or some kind of spiritual dimension of life. I really was a pretty alienated, angry, teenage existentialist, I would say. Thank God for the Beatles, you know. And, I mean, that's, you know, that's what, when I look back, I saw an old friend of mine from high school years, or grammar school as they called it over there, and I was showing him around the open center. People said, what was Ralph like as a teenager, you know? And he looked at me and I looked at him, and, you know, there were only two things that really got us through our teenage years, and that was beer and rock and roll. And I was fortunate to be there in the north of England when the Beatles burst on the scene in late 1962, 1963. I'll never forget running a cross-country race. I used to be a cross-country runner and a rugby player. And I can still remember finishing an icy cross-country race. This is the foothills of the Pennines in northern England, the backbone of England, where the winds howl down and it's deeply elemental. And I remember finishing an intense cross-country race on the snow-covered hills, foothills of the Pennines, and coming out of a shower and hearing this music. There was somebody had one of those tiny little transistor radios. Some of us here are old enough to remember that those little like 2.5-inch square transistor radios hanging on a hook in the changing room. And I heard those opening harmonica strains of Love Me Do. This is long before the Beatles came to America. And it was like, wow, from that opening bar, there was something there was something soulful, something deep, something that really hooked my psyche into that world. And I'm serious when I say it was beer and rock and roll that got us through being teenagers, because we didn't have a lot else going for us. It was a very grim world. So I really had to go from this sense of, existential meaninglessness, really, of that, we're living in this world filled with violence, war, horror, mass murder. How could there possibly be some kind of deeper spiritual reality in a world that had permitted such horrors to exist? I remember when I got to university, I remember writing my undergraduate essay on the existence of, can there be an omnipotent, omniscient God, and at the same time, can there be the existence of evil in this world? How could an omnipotent, omniscient God permit the existence of evil? This was a deep philosophical question to me. And I remember writing that undergraduate essay there at the University of Sussex, which most Americans don't know about, but I'll tell you a little bit about it in a minute. And there really didn't seem to be some kind of logical, rational way that you could reconcile the two. I mean, the first half of the 20th century, it was a nightmare in many ways. Unprecedented death, murder, horror. And so that was the world that I grew up in, really. It wasn't Californian counterculture, it wasn't holistic centers everywhere. It was a dreary and depressing world in a lot of ways. But then, of course, the 60s came along. And I was fortunate enough to ride that. Somebody was saying in one of those Amazon reviews, I seem to have been old, didn't seem like that at the time, but I seem to have been at the right places at the right times. And that, I was in the north of England when the Beatles, just 80 miles down the road from Liverpool, when the Beatles burst onto the scene. And I was there in Berkeley in the early 70s, or early mid-70s, and in Berkeley, California, and then at Findhorn, the mystical community of Findhorn in the north of Scotland, which some of you would know about and some of you wouldn't. But that was a place that really was a lot of my introduction to a sense of healing and community, and of a group of people who I felt very connected to, who shared with me that impulse for a more holistic and spiritual and ecological worldview. But I was fortunate, to get out of that grim northern world and to make my way to this place, Sussex University, which was, back in the 60s, it was the hip place to be. That was where, when it looked to, swinging London, where we think of, with the rock and roll and the miniskirts and all the rest of it, that was the academic counterpart. It was a brand new university, and it was extremely cool. It was the early days of the whole British blues boom. So Fleetwood Mac were playing at the local pub for the equivalent of 75 cents a night, and there were incredible blues musicians. And it was just that whole opening to a larger, more colorful, more meaningful existence. So that was a huge breakout for me from that grim northern reality. And then I came to America first back in 1970 as a graduate student. So I've never told these stories before. Everybody's telling me, well, I didn't know all these things about you. But so that's the thing, is to actually convey all of these. So I came as a graduate student initially. Because I did a degree in American Studies at a British university, but that was very rare. And so I thought, well, what's the point of doing a degree? You might as well actually go and see the place. So I managed to get a gig. I managed to get a gig as a teaching assistant in Chicago. So I went there, and that was wild. That was completely insane, to be plopped right down into the near north side of Chicago in 1970. The Black Panthers were being murdered by the FBI. Fred Hampton had just been assassinated, surrounded by FBI. And they just riddled the place with bullets. You couldn't even, I used to take the bus down Halstead, past the Cabrini Green, housing projects where at that time, I mean, the cops didn't even dare drive into the Cabrini Green housing project because there were literally snipers taking people out. It was intense. I mean, I was teaching a class and a lot of my students had just come back from Vietnam. And here I was, a 21-year-old Brit suddenly dealing with, Vietnam veterans who'd been in people who'd experienced the most hardcore lives in the inner city, etc. So it was a huge education. It was an education of life. I don't know what Chicago's like those days, nowadays, but in those days, it was a collection of city-states. I had to get streetwise very, very fast. And I met a guy called Dennis. I always wonder what's happened to Dennis, who was my teacher. He taught me how to be streetwise in Chicago, how the difference between this side of the street and that side of the street, between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock at night, could be the difference between life and death. And Dennis, that was his name, I wonder where he is today, he'd been drafted to Vietnam, and the only the only option he'd had is that he'd actually had himself committed to a mental asylum as the only way to avoid it, and then he'd escape through the back window. So he was a lunatic on the run when I met him, and he was one of the sanest people I ever met in my life. He taught me. I may owe my life to Dennis, or whatever he is today. Thanks, mate. So. I remember trying to find a place to live in Chicago, and I went to an area that was the old Al Capone neighborhood, and I was with this guy who'd come from California. He was a fellow teaching assistant, Tom Trombley. Where is Tom Trombley today? He had long ginger hair and a ginger beard, and we locked on this door. It was an old Italian neighborhood where Capone had been, and we knocked on the door. The guy opened it, and it's this guy in like stubble and a t-shirt. He just takes one look at us. He says, "We don't want no goddamn hippies here. Get the hell out of here." And I'd never actually heard somebody really speak with that voice, the kind of Italian, and it was like, whoa, what a fabulous accent. I can't believe I'm actually here. I've never been so pleased or chuffed, as the Brits would say, to be insulted as I was. But that Christmas of that year, of course, I, like everybody, this is the cusp of the 60s and 70s, I wanted to go to California. So I answered an ad for a co-driver. There it was, just on the university, a little sign up, so co-driver needed to LA, and I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a try. So I got back to this person. It turned out she'd been trying to find co-drivers for months, and everything had fallen through, and she and I met, and we clicked just like that. And actually, she was the first astrologer I ever met. And she did our chart, and she said, "This is going to be the best month of your life." I thought, yeah, right. And you know what? She was absolutely right, because we set off down that trip down Route 66. And we know that was for me, and that the first track of the first album, or the first side of the first album of the Rolling Stones, was "If you ever plan to motor west, taxi my way. Take the highway, that's the best. Get your kicks on Route 66. Thanks to Ross, we have. I've got acknowledgements of all these. I've had to get every time I've used a quote from a song. So it is great credit to the people who wrote Route 66. But it was that sense of freedom, on the road, down Route 66, and for me that was the spiritual turning point of my life, actually. And how about this for a synchronicity? Because people have been writing to me, reading or also writing the reviews, saying this book is filled with synchronicities about these miraculous and wonderful things that seem to have happened to you at uncanny times. Well, just the very day that Divine Arts sent me the book, and I got a box of books, which I'm entitled to as the author, the woman I took that trip down Route 66 with in 1970, who I haven't heard from in 15 to 20 years, she Facebook friended me on the very day the book arrived. I went, whoa! She was moving to LA to work in Hollywood, which she in fact did, but now she's up in Oregon. Anyway, that was just, I guess my life has been filled with amazing synchronicities. I'm the less to notice, but it has been. So yeah, we set off down Route 66, and for me, that when I look back on what was the spiritual turning point of my life, what really opened me to a deeper view of reality, it was that journey, you know, heading down out into the deserts of New Mexico, Arizona, the vast starlit skies at night. I remember pulling over to the side of the road and just hearing the pure, I'd never heard pure silence before. I remember being on the site of these 14th century Indian ruins, Native American ruins in the painted desert, and hearing the pure sound of silence for the first time ever. And then we went down to the Santa Catalina Mountains outside Tucson. You know, to me, of course, watching cowboys and Indians as a kid in Wales, it's like, wow, I couldn't believe I was actually in sort of Apache and Navajo and Hopi country and all this kind of thing. So for me, it was completely mythic. And that was, well, that journey down Route 66 for me was a huge, huge spiritual awakening. You know, maybe I was 21 years old, maybe there are certain esoteric traditions that would suggest that something, and you know, a quality of the soul emerges at 21 that is not there previously. But yeah, that's what happened to me. I had a huge series of mystical and spiritual openings on that trip. I was gone out west down Route 66 and then in California for a month. And I was never the same again. Something really opened in me to the larger cosmos. You know, I began to see how some of my own attitudes towards the world were to do with my own defensive reaction. I'd kind of closed myself off to the world. And I began to see how just actually it lay within my power to actually open myself more fully. And if I did, the universe could really come in and speak to me. And so that was such a powerful, you'll have to read the book to get the whole story, but I'm just giving you a little hint here. So, so going down Route 66, yeah, that was you know, really, even though I had to, you know, do another couple of semesters at graduate school, it had run its course for me at that point. I had the graduate school had nothing to say to me. Because at that point, the whole curriculum, you know, so much of what the Open Center teaches, it wasn't available in academia. You know, the prevailing worldview, I can remember when I got to university, I finally got to study philosophy. I was 18 years old. And what did they hand us? They handed us A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. Positivist philosophy. This was the apex of logical positivism. I remember trying to read a paragraph of that, and my impulse was to pick that sucker up and throw it against the wall. You know, A.J. Ayer was the professor of logic at Oxford at the time. He was considered the apex of rigorous philosophical thinking, and all it did, it just looked to me like a bunch of petty linguistic pedantry, where it was all just about semantic analysis. In fact, if you analyze the phrase, what is the meaning of life, with sufficient semantic linguistic rigor, you arrived at the conclusion it was a question that could not be posed. I mean, give me a break. I mean, you know, this was the kind of, philosophers, of course the root of the term is philosophers are lovers of wisdom, to go back to the original Greek. And there was no trace of it. It was a philosophical dead end. And I'm pleased to say that A.J. Ayer himself actually wound up having a near-death experience when he got older, and he renounced all his crazy philosophical stuff. At least to his great credit, he was honest enough to do that. But it really was a philosophical dead end. When I look back at my reaction, get me out of here. It was the right perspective. But you know, that trip down Route 66 for me opened up a huge amount of, it opened up a spiritual worldview. As I was saying, you know, when I was young, I could see no grounds for that. There was nothing in the world that seemed to validate that reality. And yet I began to go through these inner changes, and I could see that it was up to me, you know, how open was I going to be, how attuned to the cosmos was I going to. And then suddenly, as I describe in the book, it was uncanny. Books began to virtually, if not fall off shelves, and be sticking out of shelves by 2 or 3 inches so that I couldn't miss them. And I remember Radha Krishna. I don't know if you know Radha Krishna is a Eastern religions and Western philosophy, a great Indian philosopher who was president of India at one point. But I remember his book just completely spoke to what, it was uncanny. The first 50 pages of that book just completely spoke to my experience. And so it was like, okay, goodbye to graduate school. There's nothing here that really has anything to say to me. And I'm heading for the West Coast. And I'm going to devote myself full time to the study of esoteric, spiritual, and mystical truth. There was just one problem. I didn't know anybody on the West Coast. And, the Vietnam War was still raging. Even if I'd had a green card, I didn't want to stay in the States. So I wound up going to the West Coast of Canada, to Vancouver, which I'd heard was a beautiful place. And I think I arrived in Vancouver with $140. And I wound up trying to flog the first Canadian ecology magazine door to door. It was called The Canadian Conservationist, and I'm knocking on these doors in Kitsilano, which was like the Haight-Ashbury of Vancouver, knocking on the doors, trying in vain to sell this The Canadian Conservationist, and making a quarter for every one that I sold, and boom, dealing with the doors that were shut in my face. But it was, the Vancouver at that time was, it was spiritually open, it's the Canadian San Francisco, and but it was intellectually, there was just, in the kind of hippie enclave that I was living in, there was nobody that, there was no sense of intellectuality at all. So for me, I wind up going from being a spiritually dead intellectual academic world to being a kind of intellectually empty hippie counterculture world. So I'm still looking for something that really speaks to both sides of me. But one night in Vancouver, I was watching TV, and I saw a picture of Machu Picchu come on TV, and I went, wow. What is that? Here I am, I was only 22 years old, but thinking, here I'm a relatively educated Westerner for my age, but I don't even know that I've seen an Aztec and an Inca. And what is that? There was just some sense of mystery. And so I got it into my head to just hitchhike to Machu Picchu. And so in January of 1973, on a cold, snowy night in Vancouver, I got in the back of a van with these people, and there was a big foam mattress in the back of the van. We just got in the back of that van and we just headed off into the night to Mexico. And boom, it's a long story, but that's what Nanette referred to. There's a chapter in the book called Hitchhiking to Machu Picchu. And so I wanted to give, the book it's not just my own spiritual journey and all of that, but it's adventure. I wanted to make the book fun. And somebody was just telling me before we started that it's a laugh, I definitely wrote it for people to be entertained and to have fun. And I know certain people have been, like Sandy's been telling me, she's been laughing out loud through the book, because she knows me exceptionally well. But I don't want to inflict upon the world some dreary tome that people have got to trudge their way through. I wanted to write a book that was fun, entertaining, amusing, and deep at the same time. And judging from what people have told me so far, who people are reading, I'm so thrilled, chuffed as they would say in Britain, that a lot of people are telling me they can't put that thing down, and that it's fascinating. In fact, one person even said enthralling. So for a writer, you can't get much of a more sweet validation than that. So I think let me take another little sip of wine just to. Then I'm going to read some from the book. But let me say, that's initially I thought, well, who the hell's interested in any of all this stuff that I just told you? Nobody's really interested until I really set out on the spiritual quest, so, which was the hitchhiking to Machu Picchu. But I did decide to include these other elements within it. And of course that trip to South America was deep. It was in Machu Picchu. It took me 6 months to get there, but when I finally got there, I realized there are sacred places on the face of this earth regardless of whether there's a cathedral there, an ancient temple, whatever it is, the earth itself has its sacred places, and Machu Picchu is one of them. And that was a real insight that came to me while I was there. And later, another pivotal moment for me was when, after months in the Andes, because then after Machu Picchu we hitchhiked to Lake Titicaca over the Andes into the savanna of Bolivia. And after months in the Andes under these infinite starry skies, you know, you look when you're in the Andes up at 12, 14,000 feet and you see this incredible canopy of stars that we here in New York see virtually nothing of. You think, how could we on this little micro speck in a corner of the Milky Way, one of millions and millions, billions of galaxies, where there are these little specks on the edge of the universe, and they're not stars, they're not galaxies, they're galaxies of galaxies. And you really, when you spend time in the Andes, you really feel that. And how could we, on this little speck on the corner of the Milky Way, feel that we knew the secrets of the universe? We didn't even know about electricity 150 years ago. And it brought home to me, that the more you learn, the more you realize you have to know, or we don't know. And there's a certain humility that comes for that. But after being attuned to that world, in the indigenous world of the native peoples up there in the Andes, I remember hitchhiking down to sea level again, or close to sea level from up in the high mountains, and getting a ride in the back of a pickup truck, and it winding its way back down these endless switchbacks down to sea level again. And if you hitchhike in the Andes, it's dirt and gasoline fumes, and it's not a great way to travel, but it was the only thing I could afford at the time. But I remember getting down to close to sea level again, and for the first time I saw Western industrial civilization with fresh eyes. It was a town or a city in southern Peru called Arequipa. But I looked at that thing with the smokestacks and the chimneys and the factories, and I had one of those moments of deep intuitive insight. One of those moments of complete knowing. I just saw it with complete inner certainty. This is 1973. That Western industrial civilization, it was destroying the planet and the environment, and that it was deeply damaging our souls as well, both outer and inner, and that we had to create some kind of alternative to it. And so really, you could say when that insight came to me, I got what I needed to get from the hitchhiking to Machu Picchu. And because then that sort of gave me a frame for the rest of my life, in a sense, because that's what I've been doing ever since, is to try to create structures that can foster a more holistic, ecological, and freely spiritual consciousness, where we can build something other than this dead end of consumer capitalism and materialism that is wrecking the biosphere and deeply damaging each of our own souls. So that kind of, it took me, I wound up living a year in Colombia after that because I ran out of money. And, the person I was traveling with lost all our money trying to change it on the black market and left me with two $20 bills in Peru. So I wound up in Colombia, in Bogota for a year. And all I'll say about that is really that when I finally got out and went to California, I went to see a wise Chinese doctor who felt my pulse. He was one of those brilliant Chinese diagnosticians who can tell how long it was since you last had a cup of coffee, or how long you've been a vegetarian, just through feeling your pulse and looking at you. He looked at me, and I can still remember, Doc Wong, he laughed. And he said, "You carry on living like this," he says, "you take 10 years off your life." And I thought, yeah, that's about right. I mean, I felt like I lived 10 years worth of experience. If you're 24 years old, Bogota is a great place to be. And, but it was my equivalent of being in the trenches that my grandfather and father went through. So, so really that's what set me off on this whole journey, which wound up where starting these centers, I was at Findhorn. I don't know how many of you know Findhorn, but it's a place in the north of Scotland which I stumbled into one snowy, dark night on New Year's Eve in the waning hours of 1975. And you know, I got off the train in Scotland, I got a ride to Findhorn, it was pitch dark, you're way north there, it's the same latitude as the Hudson Bay up there. It was snowing, there was a little community centre, I hung up my coat, I walked in through those doors, they had kind of saloon doors, I walked through there, and I immediately had that sense, but I know half these people. It really was kind of like arriving in Rivendell. It really did have that feeling about it. Findhorn, this alternative spiritual community that's now an eco village and a holistic learning center, still going, started the same time as Esalen, 50 years ago. That's where it was, and indeed I have many lifelong friends who were there, right? That feeling that I had as I went through that door, I know half these people. It turned out to be exact, whatever it is, I've known them, and I plan on knowing them the rest of my life. And I feel very fortunate to have a big group of who are there all over the world now, in Australia and you name it. But I know I'm going to have those friends for the rest of this lifetime. And of course, then it was there, you know, for me from Findhorn. One of the things that I wanted to make clear in this book is I didn't want to present it as if it was a breeze, you know, as if, yeah, I went effortlessly from one thing to another, and it was all like rolled out as a magic carpet. To me, it's been very important to make clear that there were very many difficult moments along the way. I remember being in Vancouver, you know, when I went up there pretty much penniless to follow the spiritual path, you know, sitting there on those logs. I don't know how many of you know Vancouver, but looking out on that harbor with the lights of the freighters bobbing in the bay and the mountains in the distance, not knowing a soul, being broke, you know, wondering, you know, is this real? Am I really on the spiritual path here? Or am I just on the path to psychosis? Or is there actually any difference between psychosis and enlightenment? You know, of course, conventional thinking of the time would say there is no difference between enlightenment and psychosis. They're all crazy. Let's get back to the materialistic view of reality. And you know, one of the sweet things is that, as I said, on Friday, I'm setting off to do a book tour. And it's going to be a book tour of the West Coast, from the Monterey Bay up to British Columbia. But one of the really sweet karmic turns of the cycle, you know, turns of the karmic wheel, should we say, is that I'm actually going to be giving a reading at the Banyan Bookstore in Vancouver. And when I got there in 1971, penniless and wondering what the hell I was doing, I wound up staying in a little place just round the corner from this tiny little hole in the wall. I mean, literally, it wasn't much more than just a tiny little storefront, one room with all these spiritual books around it, and the atmosphere was laced with incense, and there were pictures of holy men, and I couldn't afford a book, but you know, I was in there and I would read there for hour after hour after hour. And guess what? That tiny little hole in the wall that had only been opened a couple of months earlier by a guy who had just got back from India, that's where I'm doing my reading in Vancouver, one of the places I'm doing. And it's been Vancouver's greatest consciousness bookstore for the last 20 years. And the guy who owns it is, you know, putting on a dinner in my honor, and I mean, it's just a beautiful karmic validation. You know, when I think back of being 22 years old and really wondering if I was just a fool to be doing this, you know, walking out on any kind of academia and so on, and setting off on this spiritual quest, and so it's just incredibly validating and very sweet. So for me, you know, it was Findhorn, and then Omega, and then the Open Center, but I really felt it was important to include the dark moments too, the moments of doubt and pain, of loneliness, of anxiety, of stress, of poverty, because I just think it's important. And you know, I've been talking to some people of the younger generation, people in their 20s and 30s now who've read the book, and they're telling me that this is really helpful, it's really inspiring, because for people today who are trying to follow their own inner spirit, follow their heart, their own sense of meaning. So many people, young people these days, graduate with huge college debts, and they want to devote their lives to their art or their spirituality or whatever it is, and they don't feel they can. They feel it's impossible. And so I think the book, one of the things that pleases me is like it's giving a lot of young people, those who read it, you know, a sense that if you stick in there, if you hang in there, no matter how rough and tough it can seem, it'll work out. That if you follow that inner daimon, as Socrates would have said, that it'll lead you somewhere into doing something worthwhile. So now I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I mean, where do I start? What could I do? You know, I'm not sure what I should read, and so yeah, if you need to go, just this is a good time to do it. So I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to wet my whistle. Thank you. Those are my colleagues, Andrea and Gloria. They've got to do other things, but thank you for coming. And so what shall I do? I thought I might actually just start at the very beginning of the book. You know, I wrote some of these, people speak about, Julia Cameron describes it as being written with the eye of a poet and a seeker's urgency. That was very nice of Julia to say. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the more poetic part of the book. Initially, I wrote a bunch of kind of prose poems about different parts of my life, and then somebody, an old friend of mine, actually suggested that I begin the book with this evocation of Wales. You know, the Open Centre did, I don't know, 4 or 5 sacred island retreats on this remote island on the very western tip of Wales. And I had some beautiful experiences there. So I think I'm going to read a little bit of that, just to give you a sense of some of the rhythm of it all. And then I might read you, you know, a lot of people don't know that I was program director of Omega Institute before I did the Open Centre. And so I'm sure a lot of us have been up there, so maybe I'll give you a little glimpse of what it was like to just come across that place. What is, you know, the former Camp Boyberick, this completely abandoned camp in this leaden, snow-covered day, and it's like, yeah, are you kidding me? This is, the place was an abandoned wreck that hadn't been touched in 10 years. And then maybe I'll do a little bit about the beginning of the Open Centre too, just a few little pages. How does that sound? Does that sound reasonable? So here we go. So and I do really have to thank Thomas More for, you know, I've known Thomas More. He's taught here for many years, the author of Care of the Soul. Where, you know, I asked him. I had to knock back a couple of. What were they? A couple of mimosas when having lunch with him to pluck up the courage to ask him to write the preface to the book, but he did it so graciously. And he wrote a beautiful preface to the book. I mean, kind of my jaw dropped when I read it, really. Well, oh my God, I mean, he really saw deeply into the heart of the book. So I really feel very pleased that he did that, to say the least. So I really want to thank Tom Moore for doing that. It was an act of real warmth and friendship and of great value. And of course it helps to have his name on the cover of the book. Although, you know, who was it? Somebody just downloaded it on Kindle, and for some reason it comes out as, because today was the first day, September 15th, where if you pre-ordered it, you could get it on Kindle, but they made a mistake. It actually has it as authored by Thomas More. He wrote 4 pages, but I'll take credit for the other 400, so I've got to get back. My publisher has to let Amazon know they need to get that straight. Maybe I'll sell more if everybody thinks Thomas More wrote it, so maybe I should just leave it there. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe that's a good strategy. Maybe we'll just leave it exactly the way it is. So, anyway, are we ready for this? So I'm going to do a little read, if you will, and then I'm going to just open it up to questions. So here we go. You ready? And if I'm ready, I think I need another sip of wine. Okay. Deep breath. I'm going to be doing a lot of these over the next 3 weeks, so this is the very first. So it's kind of slightly nerve-wracking, but here it is. Okay. Whoops, my lectern is wobbling here. A cold grey sea lashes the rocks on the west coast of Entley Island. The sun is setting blood red between fierce high clouds. The swell pours its surging rhythm against the island of the west. Isle of 20,000 saints at the far tip of Wales, land of my birth. The seagulls cry in their mysterious plaintive way as they surf and swoop through the air currents. What is it that I hear behind those mournful cries that seem everywhere on the Welsh shore of the Irish Sea? Something is pulling me back, touching some kind of ancestral memory. They seem to hint at the lost holy wisdom of the Celtic island saints. The cry of the birds, the crash of the seas, the smell of the salty air, the feeling of distance from the hard and petty affairs of the world, and that pervasive sense of poignant mystery that clings to the rocky edges of Western Britain and Ireland. Freed of the mundane constraints of daily life, open to contemplating the eternal, moved by the vast and empty skies, my mind gazes rapt on the setting sun slipping into the crashing seas. Here, in this psychically distant world, meta-thoughts of human destiny rise up from the mental places where they lie dormant in the rush and stress of city life. In moments like this, I can easily embrace the spiritual philosophers, the seers of the evolution of consciousness, and contemplate the spiritual future of humanity. This is the Tibet of the West, with its sense of being beyond the beyond, close to the transcendent, where the soul fills with the pulse of nature. The knot in the solar plexus quietly unravels, and the heart lifts up toward the empty sky. For centuries, Celtic monks on Iona in the Hebrides, Lindisfarne in Northumbria, and Caher off the coast of Mayo, must have known this damp and windswept but exhilarating life, misery in the lashing rain, ecstasy in the luminous spring sunshine, the bleating lambs, the mainland mountains, the peaking buds of life returning, always seeking the divine beyond the grey curtain of clouds, that eternal, steady, life-giving presence, the holy disk of the sun, once known to the Irish as the god Lug, later understood by monks as the symbol of the archangel Michael. As for me, when I gazed on Entley Island from the western headland of the Llyn Peninsula, I knew an intense tingle up the spine, the feeling of the crown of my head lifting, the sense of sheer vitality springing up from the limestone and moss below my feet. Pure cotton-white clouds softened the peaks of Snowdonia and the mountaintops of central Wales, stretching south as far as the eye could see. The comforting sound of Welsh warmed my New Yorker's heart. That tongue from an ancient time far older than English, yet somehow still loved and used a mere day's journey from London. To be an aficionado of the Celtic Holy Islands is to be blessed. A decade later, in the depths of urban stress, my memory returns to a serene and sun-filled evening, gazing out to sea from Dooney, a flattened hilltop on the Isle of Iona. Silence fills the air. The harvested fields are turning golden in the late afternoon light. The water is turquoise and smooth as glass. Fullness enters my being, a calm content. Somewhere, a tractor's engine growls in the distance. A dog barks. A fishing boat comes into view. But I am suffused with tranquility, and a quiet joy seems to invade every cell. Moments like this give strength for a lifetime. They are inner resources, precious gifts, to be drawn upon when needed. In quiet meditation, how many times have I recalled that holy Hebridean serenity? More times than I count myself, but more times than I can count. I count myself lucky to have been born in the Celtic world, the son of a Welsh father and Northern Irish mother, spending most of my childhood on the Welsh shores of the Irish Sea, playing on the Great and Little Ormes, those limestone massifs jutting dramatically towards Ireland and the Isle of Man. I spent many hours as a child absorbed in the tidal pools along the rocky beaches, looking for small pearls in mussels, gazing at the sea, absorbed by the sight of darting tiny fish amidst the seaweed and pebbles. The central myth of Western civilization, to quote Joseph Campbell, came from this part of the world, from these ancient islands. Up from the deep heart of the Celtic imagination come the tales of Arthur and the Grail and the quest. What murmurs in the soul prompt the search for the elusive and mysterious chalice. What longing still stirs for some deeper stream of reality beyond the grey, dreary world of so much contemporary life, with its shopping malls and work for faceless corporations. So that's the start. That's the first 3 pages. Gives you a little... Thank you. Yeah, have a glass of wine while we're doing it. Is anybody who knows has been on an esoteric quest with me, and we've done 11 of them, knows that there's always plentiful libations. I have never adopted a puritanical view of holistic consciousness. So, if you're half Welsh and half Irish, you don't have much choice, really. So now let me see if I can. I was going to switch to just giving a little picture of how many of you have been to Omega Institute. So I'll give you a little picture of what it was like there, and then I'll go on and do the open center, and then I want to open it to questions. So let's see if I can find it. I did have a copy of this book that I kind of turned down a corner of, but let's see, where is it?
Can you hold the mic?
Oh yeah, I should be holding the mic, that's right, yeah. It's hard to hold a book and a mic at the same time. No, I guess this isn't the. By the way, I should say it's a nice 200 pages. It's you can zip through it in no time at all. I need a bit more light here. Oh, here it is. Okay, so. Okay, you ready for a little bit about Omega? Yes. Just because it'll have a resonance with some of you. I do it, this is not the start of the chapter, I do a little bit of background. But then I say, Omega has since become widely known in the eastern United States, but there was nothing glamorous about the job of program director when I took it in 1981. As Omega was originally an offshoot of the Abode of the Message Sufi community founded by Pir Vilayat Khan that was housed in a former Shaker village, its winter offices were located in the small town of Lebanon Springs nearby. Never in my life, not even in Huddersfield, that's where I was a teenager, have I ever been so bored. During that relentless, freezing winter of 1981, every evening after work I trudged in deep snow from our small office next to the post office to my cold and drafty apartment, which I shared with a young single mother and her frequently crying baby. We were all working for a pittance, and my girlfriend had returned to Los Angeles. I could only afford one long-distance call to her of an hour each week. Hemmed in by the snow-covered hills with nothing but a grocery store and a dull bar for entertainment, there was nothing to do but watch television or read. Our tiny black and white set could only pick up one channel. So after the evening news, we were doomed to yet another showing of Family Feud. I knew this existence was beginning to take its toll when Richard Dawson, the show's host, began to appear to me as some kind of a Zen master. The nearest town was the very aptly named Pittsfield. When the weekly trip to its supermarket became the high point of my existence, the going had indeed become rough. There were, however, compensations. My colleagues and I had a whole summer to fill with innovative programs, and America was bursting with new spiritual teachers, fresh psychological techniques, innovative approaches to bodywork, and a growing awareness of the value of alternative medicine. Shamans were emerging from the jungles of the Amazon. Lamas appeared from remote monasteries in the Himalayas. Therapists were exploring the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. African and Indian ritual dancers were starting to share their art forms. Major honoraria were almost unknown in those days. So many teachers worked virtually for free. I could see from previous correspondence that my Sufi predecessors had addressed faculty as beloved ones of God, and signed their letters in the light of the One. The noble idealism of the 70s was still in the air, and teaching on holistic topics had not yet become a growth industry. The lure of big money that poisoned the 80s and changed the way holistic centers operated was still to make an impact. The first yuppies had just been sighted, and few people imagined their values would become a prolonged feature of the American scene. As the scheduling boards filled up, a new problem asserted itself. Suddenly, we were without a home. As the printing deadline approached for the summer catalog, this was becoming serious. And then we discovered Camp Boiberik, a formerly Yiddish-speaking family camp near Rhinebeck, an hour and a half north of New York City. I saw it first one snow-covered day with leaden skies. 86 buildings on 108 acres, almost all of them neglected, many with collapsed and leaking roofs. A stench emanated from the kitchen where the previous owners had abandoned many cans of food that had exploded in the summer heat. I yanked open the half-rusted door of the pantry and found myself staring at a large rat up on its hind legs, its yellow teeth exposed. I slammed the door and sighed. Would it be possible for a single decent meal ever to emerge from a place like this? Let alone to run a program serving thousands of people. Upon further investigation, we discovered that it took roughly half an hour for hot water to make its way from the aged boiler to the furthest cabins. How would that go down with demanding New Yorkers? At least in Cluney Hill, that's the place at Findhorn I was involved in starting, there was a community of hundreds to assist in the cleanup and renovation. But here we had a year-round staff of 7 or 8, and the work was equally, if not more, formidable. I began to have fantasies of participants en masse demanding their money back, and the whole summer becoming a total fiasco with me as the front man. Just my luck to become program director in the midst of a crisis. On top of this, I didn't really know what a summer camp was, having grown up in Europe. An old comical hit record I knew from the early 60s. Hello, mother. Hello, father. Here I am in Camp Granada. Began to play in my head with all its evocation of adolescent horror. This was looking decidedly grim. But the alternatives were few and far between. The catalogue deadline was almost upon us. Darrow School, that's where America had run a few things, a little place next to the abode, was adamant about refusing to take us back. and those who knew what a camp looked like in the summer thought we were in with a fighting chance. Leased for a summer with an option to buy if we survived. At least the place was dirt cheap. Like Cluny Hill, it was another white elephant in the eyes of the conventional real estate market. I learned later that Camp Boybrick had a distinguished history earlier in the century as a center of Yiddish culture, but little of that was evident in the space we took over in 1981. So that's a little bit of what Omega felt like. I can still recall that rat when that rusted door, I had to yank that open, and boom, there's a rat in the pantry, boom. Are you kidding me? This is going to be a nightmare. Of course, how many years later is it, Esalen, Omega. And I just got a very sweet call just before I came in to do this from the program director of Esalen, Cheryl Franzel, who's a good friend of mine, and just sending me my blessing. So that was very, very sweet. And okay, so let's do a little bit of the Open Center, then I want to open it up to questions. So where was I? Okay, so I went from being program director of Omega to restarting the Open Center with Walter Beebe, who was my co-founder, and we were a good mix of talents. Walter was a Wall Street lawyer with a lot of understanding of the law and business and real estate, things that I knew nothing about. But because I had the knowledge of the programs and the presenters, and I knew how to create a center and all that kind of thing. But of course, the conventional wisdom 30 years ago was, get out of here, this is New York, it'll never work. Maybe California, maybe Hawaii, Colorado at a push, but New York, get out of here. So that really was, at least to me, that's what it sounded like to me 32 years ago when we started all of this. So I'll just read the first couple of pages of, it's called Spirit in the City, New York and its Open Center. As the train from Rhinebeck made its way south, down the tracks by the Hudson River, I began to make out the city's skyline of New York. First it was the Bronx, with its rundown buildings and desperate feeling. Then away in the distance I saw the towers, pinnacles, and spires of Manhattan. A sense of the weight of the challenge began to oppress me. Here I was, taking on the formidable task of creating a center for new spirituality and culture in the midst of one of the most powerful vortices of influence and energy on Earth. You must be joking, I thought, when I pondered that I was a mere 32 and was not even American, let alone a New Yorker. The conventional wisdom in 1983 was that a holistic center would never work in New York. Come on, this is the real world. Maybe in California or Hawaii, but not here. Besides, if New York needed one, it would already have one. I heard these sentiments many times in the early months, but we pressed on, undeterred. On Christmas Day the previous year, I had met with Walter Beebe, a partner in a Wall Street law firm and a man who made a decision in midlife to make a new kind of contribution to society. He was a member of a group that had emerged with the intention of creating a holistic center in the city. Initially, the thought had been that it would provide office space for many smaller spiritual and holistic initiatives. But it soon became clear to me that something more was needed, a focal point for the new awareness, an oasis, a haven, a place that would say very clearly that New York, the biggest, baddest city in America, was filled with people who yearned for an alternative spirituality and something deeper than the secular materialism of the mainstream intellectual establishment. Over the years of searching through the countless experiences of seeing groups of strangers transformed into loving, caring units bursting with warmth for each other, I had gained the conviction that centers of new consciousness were needed all over the world. Something in my own destiny drew me to the darker corners of the human experience, like the urban grimness of Chicago, Bogota, and New York. I also loved life among the flowers and vegetables of Findhorn, or the peace and beauty of British Columbia. But always in me there has been a war between the desire for life in the slow lane and life in the fast lane. I wanted serenity and transcendence, but I also wanted edge, pace, excitement, stimulation, and the feeling of being at the center of things. Too often at Findhorn, I had been disturbed by the naivete of members about the world at large. In order for this holistic spirituality to be taken seriously, I knew it had to penetrate into the belly of the material world, into the buzz, the speed, and the stress at the center of modern life. So often when I heard about new heart, new energy, and new vision awakened in rural centers and retreats in places of beauty. But then came the dreaded return to the place of work and the soul-deadening ambience of consumer capitalism, the notorious real world, where fragile new hopes and dreams could be crushed so quickly and easily. Then the beautiful vision began to seem like a hopeless quest, and the aspiring soul was sucked back into the dreary brutality of the everyday struggle for money and survival. The Open Center, however, had the potential to be something different. There would be no real world to dread. Participants would already be there. There was just one catch. We actually had to do the long, hard work of creating a center of holistic learning right in the middle of New York's mean streets. And back in 1983, they were really mean. I could go on, but I think that's just enough to give you a little taste. Thank you, and I don't want to spoil our party here because I'm having a lot of fun. But there's something rather poignant that just happened, because there's a whole chapter in the book that is about the global network, the worldwide network of holistic centers. Most people realize that we know each other, most of us. I mean, I've been intimately involved with 3, Findhorn, Omega, of course the Open Center most of all. But there's an annual get-together, so there are many centers, and we all recognize that we're all part of facets of a different diamond. Different facets of a diamond, and we're part of that larger awakening that's going on a planetary basis. But actually there was just some really tragic news last night, which is that Harbin Hot Springs, do any of you know Harbin Hot Springs in California? Somebody at the back there does, one of the major centers of California, 2 hours north of San Francisco. It was just burnt to the ground by a massive world wildfire, unprecedented in the history of California. 4 years of drought, intense summer heat, and these huge flames. A 200-foot wall of flame came surging down the valley. And fortunately, everybody at Harbin got out. But literally, they had to run. They had to leave their pets. They had to leave everything behind, and everything's been burnt to the ground. So they're wonderful people. They're very much on the Open Center wavelength. Of course, they have the virtue of a hot spring, which attracts lots of people from all over California and beyond. But spare a thought for them, and they're part of that network of centers, that big family of consciousness that we're all part of. But they're strong. There are 170 or so of them living there. They have a tight community, and they're very financially successful. And hopefully they had insurance, so hopefully they'll be able to come back. But it's a reminder of how fragile this is. We start these centers of consciousness. They are all over the world now. They're getting to be more and more. The latest centers gathering, there's this annual get-together of holistic centers. There's going to be one in 2 weeks' time in Beijing. in communist China. I'm sorry, I should have been there. I'm going to be opening the conference, but I'm going to have to be in Iceland setting up another esoteric quest. And so I'm going to be opening the conference in Beijing over Skype at 1 o'clock in the morning in Iceland from the edge of the Arctic Circle. So, my life gets weirder by the day, but as Andrea, my colleague, had to go, said, you wouldn't have it any other way. And, she's right. Who would have known that it all worked out this way? But that's the way it's going. So yeah, let me just open it up to any questions. I see one here.
You say that you started your life with a very grim. If you had to say one thing now about your worldview or your spiritual view, what would you say now?
What would I say about it? That's a good question. I know, of course, it's almost what people say, well, they're trying to think of an answer, but what would I say about my worldview now compared to how I felt as a teenager? I would say, and I describe this in the chapter, there's a chapter called On the Edge in Colombia and California. I had an experience up top, high on the Andes. I don't know if those of you who remember, just before Christmas 1973, it was the time of the Kohoutek comet, and Bogota, or Colombia, was the best place in the world to see the total eclipse of the sun. So some friends of mine went way up, high into the mountains, got off a bus in the middle of nowhere, and skies was, clouds were scudding across the sky, so we didn't have a filter, but we could see the perfect eclipse of the sun. It was a magic, sacred moment. And I would say that there was an insight that came to me at that time, which has stayed with me ever since, which is that at the heart of every human being there's something of profound, intense, and transcendent beauty. There is a core of love within every human being. And if I had to pick one thing, I would say that's what it is, and that we're all part of some deeper destiny, some kind of profound unfoldment of consciousness that is actually more amazing than anything we can imagine within our conscious minds, and that we occasionally, in transcendent moments, we catch glimpses of it. But it's there, and the older I have got and the more life experience I have, the more it has deepened that inner conviction of me, whatever you call it, the Buddha within, the Christ within, whatever phrase. There is a transcendent source at the heart of every human being within our hearts, and that's, the more we can live our lives from that place, the more we can make a contribution to the world. Yeah. Yes.
What helped you integrate the extensive hippie self with the intellectual self?
Well, I would say initially it would be 2 words, and they would be Carl Jung. As I describe in the book, when I was 22 years old and left graduate school and went to Vancouver, the West Coast, to pursue this, because I'd had such powerful experiences, they were overwhelming to me, down Route 66 and in the deserts. And I thought, if this is real, nothing could be more important. It felt real, but there was nothing around me validating it. So I went and did that, and as I mentioned earlier, I felt it was lonely, because there were not people in that counterculture world who were more intellectually oriented. And when I came across Carl Jung there, I remember reading I think it was Modern Man in Search of a Soul, that I read in the fall of 1971, it would have been. And that book, to me, one book by Jung, was worth more than all of Marx and Freud put together. Because Jung, for me, really brought together my intellectual and my spiritual sides. He showed me that, look, I could have those transcendent experiences in the southwestern deserts, but I didn't have to give up my intellectual acuity. There's no way I'm going to do that. And so with his understanding of the collective unconscious, with the archetypes, the way mandalas appeared all over the world, even though there could be no actual geographical connection between these different cultures, and his whole notion of individuation, of really becoming our true deeper selves, He was incredibly valuable to me when I was 22. So I will always have the greatest respect and honor for Carl Jung. And that's why it's always been important to me that the Open Center, that we really include Jung. I think he's the seminal holistic psychologist of the 20th century, and so we devote a whole weekend to him in our holistic psychology certificate. Yeah. Yes, Anne.
I'm curious, the way you were growing up in your grammar school, high school, it didn't sound like there was a lot of intellectual stimulation around you. So where did you get the idea that you should go to university and look for philosophy courses?
Well, it's true, I was the first member of my family ever to go to university, but in Britain in the 1960s, it's hard to believe for Americans, but only 3% of any particular age group actually made it to university. It was a very, very small percentage. It's changed now. There are a lot more universities than there used to be. I was just one of those kids from the age of 9 years old. I was going around going, what are we here for? What's the point of all of this? And it was, the answer you got was, well, you grow up, you get married, you get a job, maybe you have kids, and then you die. And it was like, is that it? It just never seemed to me to be much of an answer. So I was just questioning, looking for these deeper truths. I wanted, I saw, because it was such a dead-end town. Today it's different. I mean, my sister stayed there, and she has had a pretty good life living there. So it's barely recognizable from what it was like today. One time I was gone for 9 years from this place, Huddersfield. That's where those of you who remember Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, he was from Huddersfield. We have a statue of him right in. But one time I was gone for 9 years, and when I came back, the whole thing had been sandblasted clean. And instead of it being, we all thought it was just jet black. We had no idea there was this beautiful millstone granite underneath it all. But I wanted to get out of there. That's why one of the songs that, thanks to Ross's assiduous editing, we've given full credit to it, but one of the theme song of me being a teenager was Barry Wiles' song and Cynthia Mann, "We Gotta Get Out of This Place." If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. Girl, there's a better life for me and you. And of course, then the next song I have to credit after that is Route 66, which was the ultimate anthem of freedom. So I wanted to get out big time. I used to have disturbing, depressing thoughts. I'd never get out of here. I used to take the bus coming from school, it was called Huddersfield New College. It was right on the edge of the moors. This is about 20 miles south of where the Brontes were in Haworth. So, if you've read Wuthering Heights, those mists and those fogs come down from the mountains. And then it's this grim industrial town. And so I wanted to get out big time. And for me, not being much as I wanted to play guitar like Eric Clapton and George Harrison, I never seemed to have the facility for it. How do you get out? Sports, music? Or for me, it was just academia. Fortunately, I had the gift to be able to, ace the exams and get out. So for me, it was the route to Sussex University, which was the swinging London counterpart in academia. And that was, even though it wasn't holistic, it was an intellectual lease of life. It was the first new university in Britain. It was designed to break the stranglehold of Oxford and Cambridge on so-called gifted people. So that was great for me to meet. It was intellectually expansive, and then also, of course, I don't mention this in the book, but of course this is the 60s, so it was also psychedelia time, and I decided to not mention this in the book, but I certainly had my share of experiences in that realm, and in the late 60s, early 70s, and those were instrumental to me in in opening up a deeper worldview and realizing there were many, many levels of consciousness and reality beyond what, 3 or 4 pints of Watney's ale was offering me on a Saturday night in Huddersfield. So it was a combination of me just always having those deep existential questions, and then stepping into a larger world and seeing that other people, and then when I began to see that these people, whether it was the American transcendentalists or whether it was the beat poets or whoever it was, that there were glimpses of this deeper spiritual worldview. And in fact, it was there, if you could see it, even what was within what was taught as part of the academic canon, but it just wasn't emphasized within the academic world. So I'd say that's what it was. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What chapters did you leave out? Or if you were going to add to the book?
Yeah, well, the original version actually was 25,000 words longer. It had a whole series of chapters on the esoteric quest, and I've done these. We just did the 11th esoteric quest in the south of France just this past June. Some of you were there, and it was an esoteric quest in the south of France. Troubadours, Cathars, Templars, and the Grail in medieval Languedoc. And when I did there is a chapter in the book called In Praise of Bohemia, and it's about me stumbling across this little village, this little town called Český Krumlov, which I later learned was the southern Bohemian Mecca of alchemists. And it was hidden behind the Iron Curtain for 60 years. It's in Bohemia. We think, well, Bohemia? Where's Bohemia? Isn't that something mythic? That's in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. Is there really a Bohemia? There is a real Bohemia, and I'm a natural Bohemian. And but it's the western part of the Czech Republic. When the Czech Republic split from Slovakia, if the central portion of the 3 aspects of Czechoslovakia had gone with Slovakia, we would once again have had Bohemia appear in this world. Because the ancient kingdom of Bohemia goes back 1,000 years. Czechoslovakia was invented in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and only lasted a matter of decades. So it was. There is this one description of me coming from a holistic centers gathering in Germany with a friend, driving into Bohemia and stumbling late one night, crossing this old stone bridge under an archway, driving through these little deserted, winding, narrow, cobbled streets with yellowing lights, turning, whoa, what is this? What century have we stumbled into? Neither she nor I had ever been to Czechoslovakia before. It was a mysterious world, in the immediate aftermath of communism. And then suddenly we turn a corner, we cross this old wooden bridge, and there's this huge castle rising up out of the sea, out of the water. Oh my God, what is that? And then we wound up staying in this 16th century building, and we woke up in the morning, threw open the walls were this thick, and we threw open these casement windows, and down there was a river rushing down below. We could hear bird song, and there was this alchemical castle on the other side of the town. And when we went down for breakfast in the morning, there were red roses on all the walls all around the breakfast room. I thought, oh my God, what is this? Nobody spoke a word of English, but the friend I was with spoke German. She is German. So she was able to translate, and because they only spoke Czech, Russian, and German. And then I realized, oh my God, I have I went up to the castle, and we found that the castle belonged to Count Wilhelm Rosenberg, who was the sole brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who was the alchemical emperor. And that this little forgotten town that had been preserved totally uncorrupted for centuries was, as I said, the southern Bohemian Mecca of alchemists. And that Wilhelm Rosenberg had been a practicing alchemist, just like the Holy Roman Emperor was. He switched the imperial capital from Vienna to Prague because of this. And so I stepped straight into this esoteric world, and then I wound up trying to say to my Czech friends, do you know that this is actually a turning point in Western humanity? This is what the great historian, I don't know how many of you know her, but there's a great historian called Frances Yates. She wrote a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. She was the reader in history at the University of London at the Warburg Institute for many years, great woman. And she brought alive this whole period of the late 16th, early 17th century, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. You don't normally put Enlightenment and Rosicrucian together. It was when alchemy, Kabbalah, Hermetic philosophy, and Neoplatonism, all these streams came together. So I realized I'd stumbled into this incredible world. So the Czechs, having put up with 30 years of the Habsburgs and then the Nazis and then the communists, they were so disconnected from their own history that I tried to persuade them to do something. I realized it wasn't going to go anywhere. They didn't have the resources to do it. Well, I'm just going to have to do it. So then that's what I decided to do. I created this event. It was a wild shot in the dark. I called it the Rosicrucian Enlightenment Revisited. And I invited every single person I admired in the Western esoteric tradition. And the amazing thing was, nobody had ever heard of this place. Every single one of them said yes. And there was only one guy, Gareth Knight, who was not, at that point wasn't giving any public talk, so he declined. He came to something later. But every single person, and Gnosis magazine described it as an esoteric Woodstock. You name it, I was stunned. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget going, Robert Bly was there. He was at many of our esoteric conferences in the early years. I remember walking through those cobbled streets and heading up towards the alchemical castle, and a full moon rises from behind the battlements. I thought, who the hell choreographed this? It wasn't me, and Robert Bly gave this beautiful reading in the Renaissance room by candlelight in this 16th century castle of Sufi and Rosicrucian poetry. And little did I know that not only would that be an absolutely spectacular event, that goes down for me as one of the peak experiences. And I'm fortunate to say the esoteric class have given me many peak experiences. But that was, that opened up the door to what's been 20 years now. I had no idea that was a wild, wild shot in the dark. And I had no idea that would actually turn into a 20 years and counting series of conferences on the Western esoteric tradition, because of course, in the holistic world we've got, there's any number of programs in yoga and Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and so on, and shamanism, but the Western tradition, which is, for those of us who come out of a Western European background, it's our own indigenous tradition, and yet it tends to be completely neglected, and yet it's brilliant, and it's full of so many wonderful things. And so it's been a great pleasure of mine to do this sort of cultural excavation into the lost spiritual history of the West. So that, I had originally had 25,000 words on these esoteric quests, but the publisher was very clear. And I've really come to believe that Michael Wiese is his name, that Michael was right. I met him on an esoteric quest, as I mentioned earlier. I met him in Alexandria in Egypt, and that's when I learned he was a publisher. And I think that's the next book. So the next book is going to have a lot of that in it, and it's going to have, people want me to write about all the people I've met, because of course I've met outrageous people over the last 30 odd years doing this. What's it like to have dinner with R.D. Laing? You don't want to get into an argument with R.D. Laing, I can tell you that, especially if he's had a few glasses of wine. Colin Wilson, James Hillman, Robert Bly himself, who's not really going out. I've had the great privilege of meeting many of the most outstanding presenters and poets and artists and writers of our time, the real pioneers. So I've got a lot of material for the next one, because I don't think that this is going to be the last one. Yes, John?
Ralph, I want to thank you for writing this book. You mentioned Robert Bly, and I first became aware of Robert Bly watching Bill Moyer.
Yeah.
And I say that because I think people like you, Ralph, ought to be seen more out there. I look at the media and how debased it's becoming. You talk about those faceless corporations. Well, they are controlling so much of our media, our education system. I teach I came from my class today at NJIT, where I'm teaching in Newark, class. There are young people who are very apathetic about, you know, the way things are in society. They have to make a living, and a lot of young people don't feel that they can go on these dreams and on these quests. And I think the offer here is so essential. And if you do not get on Charlie Rose, I am canceling my. But I really think, and you know, especially like what's going on, I'm trying to think, because what I love about you, Ralph, you know, is that you have a spiritual side, you have the joy of living, of life, of nature. I've been involved for the past 10 years with Annette in a group called the Network of Spiritual Progressive, started by Michael Lerner, who was given a talk here at the Open Center. You know, and so that's raised my consciousness a lot. But what you also bring is this sort of real politique critique of the status quo. And we don't see too many people bridging the spiritual and the political. Bernie Sanders gave a talk a couple of days ago at Liberty University. Everybody's seen that talk, which to me just is incredible. I want to show this to my students, okay? And you're in that territory. You're sort of in that space. And I'm wondering, you know, how we can get you out there more, how more people can see this. Because New York, to me, it's not, you know, I remember my dinner with Andre when it came out in 1980. And somehow that's coming up for me with this book and this work of yours. That, you know, he came to New York in 1983, my dinner with Andre comes out in 1980. That this kind of reality also exists. But how who can afford this stuff anymore? With the rising rents and the billionaire class and this. But we have to hang on, and we have to unite all the positive things that are happening with between Occupy Wall Street, between Bernie Sanders, between you and this work. And how do you see this going forward? Has Charlie given you
No, I hate to receive, but Charlie's invitation will be gratefully received.
I heard that Stephen Colbert is looking.
Oh, maybe Stephen Colbert. Yeah, I'll take that.
So thank you so much, Ralph, for this book. It's very nourishing. I can't wait to read it. And you give me hope as a role model, as a hero in my life, and so I can continue to do this work in the world and bring it to my students. And you're a wonderful man. Thank you for you and Annette.
Oh, thank you. Well, how is it all going forward? It's just it's, you know, it ain't a magic trick. It's just that all of us sitting here in this room, all of us who feel connected to the holistic, ecological, freely spiritual worldview, we've just got to get out there and just keep on doing what we do, whether we're in education, in business, in science, in politics, whatever it is, we just have to keep on trucking and not take no for an answer. We know that the worldview, the consumerist, materialist worldview is just leading us into a complete dead end. You know, we've gone, more and more people are seeing that. And when I look back on those early years of the Open Center, when alternative medicine was dismissed as snake oil, there were regular op-ed pieces in the Times dismissing it as snake oil. There were pieces in the Times dismissing every form of mystical exploration, including Jung, as opening the door to irrationality and fascism. You know, the biggest health food stores were little mom and the pop, hole in the walls. There were, you know, people hadn't awakened to the need for a green, sustainable future. I see, you know, I think the hope lies in the fact that it's getting out there more and more. It's actually, for those of us who've been on the inside of this, like I have for 35, 40 years, it's incredibly inspiring to see the way it's made its way from the periphery more and more into the mainstream of the culture. You know, if I saw the way it used to be 10 years ago, if I saw the word holistic in the New York Times, I was going around after everybody saying, "Did you see that on page 27 of the Times?" I mean, now if they do something on another yoga center, on mindfulness, you know, I mean, we had John Kabat-Zinn here, you know, way back when. Of course, last time I saw a picture of John Kabat-Zinn, he was coming out of number 10 Downing Street after just meeting with the Prime Minister of Britain, you know, about how to bring mindfulness into British education. I mean, you know, if you've been on the inside of this, you've seen it make its way into the culture, bit by bit. Obviously, we have political figures who are aware of this, even though they don't it's not politic for them to describe it in so many details. So it's a struggle for the soul of humanity. You know, we have these regressive impulses, the fundamentalism, all the different kinds of religious fundamentalism. I don't care what religion you have, you don't want holistic fundamentalists either. You know, you've got the scientific materialism, the insistence that there is nothing other than this sense-perceptible world. You've got grotesque forms of nationalism appearing. You know, you've got all these counterforces, but we have this, we have our thing, and it's growing stronger, and there will inevitably be setbacks, but it has the force of life itself. And you know, as I say in the epilogue to the book, the current narrative that is being offered to young people of a consumerist, materialist world, hyper-capitalist, it doesn't have the narrative power to speak to them. There's got to be a different story, a different fundamental sense of what we're all doing here, to seize the imagination, to grip the souls, and to inspire the younger generation. And I think they're hip to it. You know, you go to Burning Man. I mean, Burning Man, yes, on the one hand it's the biggest party in the world, but on the other hand it's like a great big open center. It's very holistic, it's very ecological, it's very spiritual, and it's also wild and sexy and crazy at the same time. But all of those things can exist. And you know, you look at the generation who are there at Burning Man, and you can see it's not as if, it was the same when I was teaching at NYU, it's not as if this is just for the baby boom generation that I'm part of. The young people, I'm sure those of you who have kids or have young nieces and nephews and so on, know this. Young people are very much engaged with this. They see the devastated environment they're being handed, and they want something different, and they've got those same deep existential spiritual questions. So I think we're part of something larger. And I think there are spiritual forces that are working with us in all of this, and we just have to keep on trucking and don't take no for an answer. I think maybe we'll take one last question and then we'll say good night to everybody, or maybe that's it. Maybe that's a good ending. I see one last question. Okay.
You're an incredibly engaging speaker.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that as an astrologer, there is a cosmic force this year. Jupiter just entered Virgo, the sign of the goddess of a pristine environment. So the next year, the environment gets a big boost, as does labor and the little guys. So this is a year where we can push forward and really return to the sacredness of the earth.
I'm ready for that. So I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you everybody for coming. We have some wine at the back if you want to stick around. Thank you. Oh, and if you do buy the book and read it, all I request is that you write a review on Amazon, because that's how you flog books these days. That's all. Yeah.
Just sign it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I forgot to say I'm going to be signing books. If you want to buy a book here, just go down and buy it at the Open Center store, and I'll come back up here and I'll sign it. Okay. All right.
You're going to flip out because I have to have a meeting with you. Do you know who the Earth Guardians are?
I've heard of them.
The young boys?
Yeah.
I tell you a lot.
Okay. Well, let's do it.
But I want